first a little bit about markets and marketplaces and why it is that economists find themselves thinking about things like kidney exchange. The clue is exchange. And by the end, I hope to talk a little bit about what kinds of rules marketplaces need to work well, because that's something that Washington is a good place to think about. So I wrote a book about this. Let's see if I, no. Okay, I've spoiled the, can you get me back on?
Yep.
Thank you. So I wrote a book called Who Gets What and Why about markets and marketplaces, and it came out a couple of years ago. And one of the things about having a book come out is after a little while translations come out. And that's a natural thing for books on markets, because marketplaces, and languages have a lot in common. They're both ancient human artifacts. Often we think of languages as just something that we receive, but of course languages are collective tools that we build to communicate with each other, and so are markets. And just as there are lots of different kinds of languages, lots of different languages, there are lots of different kinds of markets and marketplaces. And in particular, I think when we think about markets, we often think about commodity markets, but not every market is a commodity market. Let's think for a moment about what a commodity market is. Right, so here's a picture of the New York Stock Exchange. And when you trade on the New York Stock Exchange, you don't have to know who you're trading with. The job of the New York Stock Exchange is just to find the prices at which supply equals demand every moment of the day for each of the financial commodities that are being traded. You don't care who you're buying from and whether they took good care of those shares. They don't worry about whether you're going to take good care of those shares. And commodity markets need to be designed. One of the things I like to think about is that God made wheat, but the Chicago Board of Trade made #2 hard red winter wheat, and that's what we make bread out of. And you could buy 5,000 bushels of that without seeing it because it's a commodity. But in many markets, you care who you're dealing with, and prices don't do all the work. And in kidney exchange, which I'll tell you about, we don't even let prices do any of the work. And these are matching markets. They're matching markets where you care who you deal with, and supply doesn't necessarily equal demand. So, for instance, I come from Stanford University, and Stanford doesn't fill its entering class by raising tuition until demand just equals supply. Right? We've got some number of students we'd like to attract each year. You could imagine we could raise tuition until just enough students wanted to come, but that isn't the way college admissions works in the United States. It's expensive to go to Stanford, but being able to afford the tuition doesn't get you in. You have to be admitted. And similarly, labor markets are like that. You can't just decide to go work for Google. You have to be hired. And neither can Google just decide who works for them. They have to compete with Facebook. And they don't choose their engineers by lowering the wage until just enough engineers want to come. They've got a great job to offer. And so markets like labor markets, like college admissions, have a lot of other institutions in them than just price discovery. The job of the market is not simply to find prices at which supply equal demand, but to make good matches, to find good employees for Google, to find good students for Stanford. So matching markets are markets in which you can't just choose what you want, even if you can afford it, but you also have to be chosen. And that makes matching markets a little bit like marriage. There's courtship involved. You can't just choose your spouse. You also have to be chosen. And so lots of markets are somewhere between pure commodity markets like the New York Stock Exchange and pure matching markets, maybe like marriage. And of course, nowadays we're seeing computer-assisted markets, and they make markets more ubiquitous. I just turned off my smartphone. It's a marketplace in which I could buy a taxi to the airport, or an airplane flight, or a hotel, or any other thing. So markets are now very close to us all the time. And there are lots of different kinds of markets, and one of the things that computerized markets do is make it very easy to study the rules of the market, because they have to be coded. They have to be written with sufficient precision that they can be turned into software. So let's think about matchmaking itself, marriage and dating. There are starting to be all these dating apps. Match.com is an old one, so some of you are too young to remember it. And it showed people, men and women, lots of different people that they could date. It became very quickly a sort of congested market. It was hard to navigate through all the different people you might meet. And so matchmaking services like eHarmony tried to help by showing everyone only a a few people at a time, so that the people you wanted to meet would have time to talk to you, and you would have time to talk to them. And today, with the internet having given way to smartphones and apps, there's a whole group of new dating apps like Tinder, where they try to deal with congestion by making every transaction very fast. And Bumble and Hinge, which try to curate in different ways who you meet and who can talk to whom. So these are markets that all have different rules aimed at the same thing, to match people to each other. So there are lots of other kinds of matchmaking, of course, and we're seeing many marketplaces show up on our smartphones, from Uber and Lyft to Google is a market for ads, and eBay and Amazon are markets for goods. So they'll be sending drones to deliver them. And I'm going to talk to you a bit about kidneys, but I want you to think about kidneys a little bit in that context. That is, we're trying to find matches that will help people live their lives better. So before we talk about kidneys, though, let's think about what all marketplaces have to do to work well. And for that, I'm going to use Airbnb as an example, because I'm pretty sure that's a market that's familiar to everyone. And the first thing that Airbnb has to do, and any marketplace has to do, is they have to make the market thick. They have to bring a lot of buyers and sellers together, a lot of travelers and hosts together who can do business with each other, so that Airbnb becomes a desirable marketplace to go to when you want to rent a room or rent your room to someone. And initially what Airbnb did is they bought up some of their competitors who were, in those days, other websites that offered travelers rooms, like CrashPad in London. And that allowed them to get to serve travelers from London who wanted to go to San Francisco, as well as travelers from San Francisco who wanted to go to London. But today, of course, they're a giant hotel company, and their competitors are other big hotel companies. And thinking about the difference between Airbnb and a conventional hotel will help us focus on congestion, which is a big deal in markets and a big deal in kidney exchange. So let's think about the problem about a hotel like the Capitol Hill Hotel where I stayed last night. Okay? Suppose when I wanted to make a reservation at the Capitol Hill Hotel, I could only ask about one room at a time, which is a little bit the problem you have with Airbnb, but since many hosts are only offering one apartment or one guest room. So I'd call up the Capitol Hill Hotel and I'd say, do you have a room for Monday night? And they'd say, well, which room are you interested in? And I'd say, how about room 226? And they'd say, I'm so sorry, room 226 is booked. And then as you'd say to the receptionist, don't hang up, you should hang up, and you'd have to call again, and you'd say, how about room 225? And say, oh, yeah, room 225 is available. We can put you up in that. So that's sort of Airbnb's problem. That is, when you try to rent my guest room in California, if someone has already rented it, you can't have it. And then you have to try to rent a room from someone else. So Airbnb, what makes it an effective app is that they've worked hard to avoid that kind of congestion. In the very early days, you might wait a day until I came home from work, and then I would say to you, I'm sorry, you weren't the first person to reserve the room. I've given it to someone else, and then you'd have to try again. But today, once one person tries to reserve my California guest room, it disappears from everyone else's app. And so they make the process of search much easier and help you deal with congestion. And if they didn't, we would never have heard of Airbnb. Just as markets have to be thick in order to be successful, they have to deal with congestion, which is one of the perils of success. Once you have a thick market, you have to help people deal with evaluating all the different alternatives that might be available. And finally, what marketplaces have to do is be trustworthy and safe. So for Airbnb, that means if I'm trying to rent your apartment, you should know that I've already been a guest in some places and I haven't trashed the apartment. And if you're trying to rent my apartment, you should know that the picture that you see with the beautiful view of the mountains and the ocean all out the same window is actually what you're going to see when you come to my apartment. And it's not a photoshopped image of some other apartment. So markets to work well marketplaces to help markets work well have to make the market thick, they have to deal with congestion, and they have to be safe. So I've been involved in a couple of different matching markets. For labor market for doctors, that's a market where money plays a role. Doctors are paid wages, but it's a matching market like any labor market. It doesn't clear by having prices adjusted as supply just equals demand as if it were a commodity market. Some of the tools we've used for labor markets for doctors have been useful in school choice. Here in Washington, D.C., there's some school choice that uses the deferred acceptance algorithm, something that Lloyd Shapley and and David Gale developed, and I shared the 2012 Nobel Prize with Lloyd Chapman. David Gale was no longer living at that time. Indianapolis is going to have such a school choice system next year, so this is something that we're seeing spread around the country. But what I'm going to talk to you about today is kidney exchange, possibly because that's the most exotic of the marketplaces I've dealt with, and also because it's one where we don't use money at all to decide who gets what. And so that's a way of emphasizing that in matching markets, they're not all about money. Okay, so let me tell you a bit about kidney exchange. The first thing to know is there aren't enough kidneys for transplant. So this morning, there are over 100,000 people waiting on the deceased donor waiting list in the United States. And we only do about 12,000 deceased donor transplants a year. So it's a really long wait, and it's a dangerous wait. Thousands of people die each year while they're waiting. But kidneys are special in a couple of ways, and one of the ways they're special is that living people have 2 kidneys, and if you're healthy enough, you can remain healthy with just one. And that means that if you love someone who is dying of kidney failure, you might be able to save their life by giving them a kidney. And we have about 6,000 transplants a year in the United States, with a little fewer last year, about 5,600, from living donors. Okay, so sometimes you can save the life of someone you love by giving them a kidney. But as you saw in the video, sometimes you're healthy enough to give someone a kidney, but the person you love can't take your kidney because kidneys have to be well managed. And that's what opens up the possibility of exchange and brings economists into the picture. So the simplest kind of exchange is simply just 2 pairs. And if you look at the screen here, you see that pair 1, the donor has blood type A, but the recipient needs a kidney of blood type B or a blood type O. It can't take a kidney of blood type A. And similarly, pair 2 has the opposite problem. The donor has blood type B and the recipient is blood type A. So what used to happen, and you wanted to give you wanted to give a kidney to someone, but you couldn't, is they'd send you home and you would disappear from the medical system. But what kidney exchange is about is keeping these people in the system and observing that you might be able to help the person you love get a kidney by giving a kidney to someone else and getting a kidney from their donor. Okay, so that's the simplest exchange, and that creates 2 more transplants than would have been possible otherwise, 2 compatible transplants. So you notice that no money changes hands, just kidneys, and that's partly because in the United States, like just about everywhere else in the world, it's illegal to buy a kidney for transplant. So the National Organ Transplant Act of 1984 says it's unlawful to acquire or transfer any human organ for valuable consideration for use in human transplantation. So the lawyers in the crowd might worry that exchange has valuable consideration. There's a kidney. Kidneys are pretty valuable, but Congress cut the Gordian knot by amending the act in 2007 to say that preceding sentence, the one that says you can't give valuable consideration, doesn't apply to kidney exchange. And the phrase human organ paired donation is a polite phrase for kidney exchange that doesn't use the word exchange. So no valuable consideration under the terms of the act is given when we do a kidney exchange, and it's a legal thing to do. So why is it that there are laws against selling kidneys? I don't know the answer to that, but it's against the law just about everywhere in the world, with the single exception of the Islamic Republic of Iran, where they have a monetary market for kidneys. And there are black markets around the world. It's a hard market to suppress. So let's say that can come back to this a little bit. Let's say that a transaction is repugnant if some people would like to engage in it and other people think they shouldn't. So buying a kidney for transplantation is a repugnant transaction in that sense. There are people who would like to buy one, there are people who are willing to sell one, but it's against the law. And when you see something that's against the law everywhere, it suggests that it's going to constrain what you can do, right? This isn't a peculiarity in the United States. If the story were that it was legal everywhere except the Islamic Republic of Iran, you wouldn't be surprised. You'd say, well, they're a strange country. But it turns out that buying and selling a kidney is against the law just about everywhere. So this is something worth understanding. You know, it's a social science issue. It turns out there are lots of repugnant transactions. Well worth understanding. But for helping people get kidneys, you have to work with that as a constraint. And kidney exchange is a way of helping people get more transplants without coming up against the repugnance of using money to decide who gets what. So that's the way to think of kidney exchange as a marketplace that is a very different marketplace than it would be if it were legal to use money, although it would still be a matching marketplace. can't give valuable consideration for a kidney, that actually causes some congestion. So here's a picture, 2 pictures, taken in Cincinnati, Ohio in 2006. And in the left picture, there's a kidney on the table. I'm the man in the yellow gown, keeping my hands out of the way so that no one hands me anything. And that kidney is going into the gentleman in the right picture. And behind me in the left picture, where you can't see it, is another operating room just steps away, and that's where the nephrectomy was done, the removal of the kidney to transplant. And the lady who is giving the kidney that's in that left picture, she actually lives in Toledo, Ohio. And she traveled here to Cincinnati, and the Cincinnati donor, the donor who loves the man getting the transplant, he traveled to Toledo, Ohio. And both operations happened at the same time. The man in the red cap is a surgeon named Steve Woodle. From the operating room, after the patients in Cincinnati had been anesthetized and had initial incisions made, he got on his cell phone from the OR. He called up High Grease in Toledo, Ohio, and he said, "We're ready in Cincinnati. Are you ready in Toledo?" And when he heard that they were, all 4 surgeries went on, the 2 nephrectomies and the 2 transplants. And the reason they all have to go on at the same time is you can't give valuable consideration for a kidney. It means you can't write a contract on a kidney that says, we'll give you a kidney today, and you give us a kidney tomorrow. So to make sure that everyone who's supposed to get a kidney gets one, they do the operations at the same time. But that's really cumbersome, because to do even that simplest exchange between just 2 pairs, you have to have 4 operating rooms and 4 surgical teams available at the same time. And if you wanted to do a 3-way exchange among 3 pairs, you need 6 operating rooms. So it turns out we can do that. It took a little while. But that's about, there have been some bigger exchanges, but that's about the biggest circular exchange that you can reliably do. So the question is how to get more transplants, how to deal with congestion so that you can get around this logistical problem. And one way to do that involves non-directed donors. Every now and then, about 200 times a year in the United States, someone shows up who would like to give a kidney to someone, like to donate a kidney, but it doesn't have anyone in particular in mind. And as you can imagine, you go through not just medical tests, but psychological tests of various sorts to qualify as a donor. It's not so easy. But what we used to do before kidney exchange, once you qualified, is you say you could give to someone, one of those 100,000 people on the waiting list for deceased donors. But now that there's this thick market of patient-donor pairs waiting for exchange, you can offer sometimes a more enticing prospect to a non-directed donor. You can say you could donate to one of the recipients in a patient-donor pair, and their donor would donate to someone else, and their donor would donate to someone else. So the video you saw beforehand talked a little bit about that. And so that involves, that raises the possibility that a non-directed donor can save more than one life. And this picture here, and this one, which is from a photograph of people involved in such a chain in 2007, shows 6 people in the picture. And the question is, why 6? And it's because, as I said, 6 was about the biggest number of operating rooms and surgical teams that we could reliably assemble at the same time. But when you start looking at chains, you realize that there might be a way to create more transplants. And that's because when you start with a non-directed donor, each pair gets a kidney before they give one. And that cuts down the risk of having a break in the chain. So let's look at the left here. Let's think about why we do simple pairwise exchanges simultaneously, and so we need 4 operating rooms at the same time. Suppose we didn't do it simultaneously. We always do these simultaneously, but suppose we didn't. And donor 2 on day 1 gives a kidney to recipient 1. And then for whatever reason, donor 1 fails to give a kidney to recipient 2 on day 2. That's what that broken line is. Well, this would really have harmed pair 2, donor 2 and recipient 2. They had a surgery that didn't help them. And even worse, they no longer have a kidney to participate in kidney exchange next week. And so they've really been harmed. So we never let that happen. The way we stop that from happening is to do those simultaneously. But when you look at the non-directed donor chain, the non-directed donor gives a kidney on day 1 to recipient 1. If, for some reason, donor 2 failed to give a kidney on day 2 to recipient 2, that would be very, very disappointing. But pair 2 would not be irreparably harmed. They'd be no worse off than they were before the non-directed donor appeared. And in particular, they'd still have a kidney. They could participate in kidney exchange tomorrow. And so the fact that the cost of a broken link is less possibility of seeing whether you can run these chains out longer. And indeed you can. The first one was reported in New England Journal of Medicine and then in Parade magazine. And you can see there are 20 people in the picture. So it's 10 nephrectomies and 10 transplants. And the last lady in the picture, I don't know whether you can see this, but the last lady in the picture who identified herself, so I can speak her name, is a lady named Helena McKinney. And she was blood type AB. And that turns out to mean she can only give a kidney to someone else who's blood type AB. And there's only about 4% of Americans who have blood type AB, and mostly they can take the kidney from whoever loves them, because if you have blood type AB, you can take a kidney of any blood type. But sometimes there are other reasons why you can't take a kidney. But what that meant was it was hard to find a patient for her to continue the chain. So nowadays we ask someone like that to just give a kidney to someone on the deceased donor waiting list. But in those days, she was willing to wait, and everyone was willing to wait. It took 3 years, and 3 years later, she added 12 more people to the picture, so 6 more transplants and 6 donations. So our experience has been that people are a lot nicer than economists often give them credit for. They have to give us credit for. And there's only about a 2% rate of broken legs among people who are asked to wait and give a kidney later. Okay, so sometimes the chains are very long. This picture has 60 people in it, 30 transplants and 30 nephrectomies. And indeed, the practice of kidney exchange using both cycles and chains has grown in the US to become a very standard part of transplantation. This shows kidney pair donation and non-directed donor chains as percentage of living donation in the United States, and it's up around 14%. So there's still a lot of work to do. We're not home free by any means. There's 100,000 people on the waiting list. But this is now something that we can do, and we can start to think about how to expand it. The big jump between, say, 2007 and 2011 has to do with integrating chains into the system, getting rid of the congestion that I just told you about. And a bunch of other smaller changes have led to further growth. But one of the big things now is about how to make kidney exchange available to more people, how to make the marketplace thicker. Incidentally, it's also spreading around the world. I have a blog where I celebrate first kidney exchanges in different countries. But although it's going around the world, the situation in Europe is much the same here. This shows the growth of kidney transplantation in Europe, and then the top line is the growth of the waiting list. So there's a terrible shortage. And this graph, looking around the world, shows the blue lines are the number of deceased donors per million population, and the orange lines are the number of living donors per million population. And the United States and Western Europe are in the right-hand side. That's where lots of transplants happen. But you can see that there are other places, and I've highlighted Mexico and the Philippines, where some transplants happen. That is, there are excellent hospitals where you could get first-rate care. But not many transplants happen. And there the barriers are mostly financial. That is, Philippine health insurance doesn't cover transplantation. It only covers 40 some odd days of dialysis. And so end-stage renal disease, kidney failure in the Philippines is a death sentence. On the other hand, what that means is there are people in the Philippines and Mexico who, if it were possible, would be happy to come to the United States and participate in American kidney exchange, and whose presence would help Americans who might not be able to find compatible transplants otherwise. So one of the questions is how to finance this, right? That's an expensive business, transplantation. But it turns out this can be self-financing, because every time an American is transplanted, it saves some part of the American healthcare system about $250,000 in the first 5 years. And that's because dialysis is very much more expensive than transplantation. So kidney transplantation is one of the few areas of medicine where the best treatment is also the cheapest. And end-stage renal disease takes up 7% of the Medicare budget. It's a giant part of American healthcare. So what's a global kidney exchange? The idea is it would just be regular kidney exchange, except possibly one of the pairs would be there because poverty was the barrier that kept them from getting a kidney transplant rather than immunological or blood type incompatibilities. So the first one that we did in 2015 was a Philippine pair. Here's the chain that they participated in. Again, I don't know what you can see, but the very first donor is an American non-directed donor. The first pair in that chain is the Philippine pair. And he is a blood type A donor, as was the American non-directed donor was blood type A, which means it's a little hard to start a long chain with that particular American non-directed donor. But the wife of the Filipino patient was a blood type O person, and it's easier to start a long chain. And here's the chain that resulted. So there are 11 transplants that go on there, with the first pair being the Filipino pair. And the reason that can be paid for is because so much money is saved when the Americans are transplanted, right? Dialysis costs about $90,000 a year. That's more or less the Medicare number. It's about 3 times that for the first, if you have private insurance, for the first 33 months you're covered by your private insurance at a much higher rate. And that cost is saved, it's replaced by about $20,000 a year in the United States for immunosuppressive drugs. Once you've had a kidney transplant, you take immunosuppressive drugs for the rest of your life. But that means in the first 5 years we save around $250,000. So the Philippine pair has now passed their first anniversary. They're back in the Philippines where adequate care is available. If you can pay for it, there's an escrow fund that takes care of them, and they seem to be doing pretty well. Now, I mentioned repugnance at let me talk a moment about the financial costs. A lot of the engineering still to be done here has to do with getting the money from where it's saved to where it's spent. Right? There are additional costs in bringing a Philippine pair to take part in American transplantation. It involves the transplantation, the surgeries themselves, and then immunosuppressive drugs for the Philippine patients. So the savings are, a lot of the savings in that chain are from Medicare, but a great deal of them also from private insurers. And they have to go to pay the new costs, which involve the surgeries and the post-surgical treatment in the home countries, and perhaps helping develop surgical infrastructure in the home countries. It turns out, this was a little bit of an education for me, it turns out insurance companies are not terribly interested in these savings because insurance companies are mostly pass-through. If I'm an insurance company and I insure your company and you have high expenses this year, then the premium will be higher next year. And it doesn't really matter to me the level of the costs. But the people who are very sensitive to the costs are the self-insuring companies. And a lot of big American companies are self-insuring. If you were to work for one of them, you might have a Blue Cross card and think that Blue Cross was your insurer. But often what's going on is that Blue Cross has been retained to do the administrative work of negotiating the prices and directing who should pay the bills, and ultimately it's your company that pays the bills. So that's the case at Stanford, where I work, for instance. I have a Blue Cross of California card, but if I were to get sick, Stanford would pay for dialysis for me for the first 33 months, and then Medicare would afterward. That's the way we organize dialysis in the United States. So the first paper reporting this first global kidney exchange just came out in the March issue of the American Journal of Transplantation, together with an editorial in the same issue saying that maybe this is a repugnant transaction. Right? So there was an editorial that said, are we walking a tightrope or blazing a trail? And the editorialists said, that there are a lot of ethical challenges. And what they were disturbed by was, one of the things they were disturbed by was this picture, which shows 10 Americans and 1 Philippine pair getting a transplant. And we look at it, we say each pair gives a kidney and gets a kidney. That's how American kidney exchange works. But the editorialists looked at it and they said, gee, maybe we're exploiting that Philippine pair because 10 Americans got a kidney as a result of their presence in the chain. This is not a repugnance that I have a lot of sympathy for myself, but repugnance is serious stuff, right? I mean, it's against the law everywhere in the world to buy a kidney. We wouldn't want it to become against the law to bring Filipino patients into American exchange. So these are questions that will involve market design. We'll have to make sure that everything is transparent enough and clear enough so that everyone can see transparently that this is something that gives mutual benefit to the patients in the developing world and the patients in the developed world. And incidentally, we recently did a similar chain in Mexico. And when you interview the patients, there's no doubt about it. So here's Newsweek on Espanol. This is last week's Newsweek in Mexico. And what they say is kidney exchange between the United States and Mexico is a bridge of life. And they have a little map, and you can see it starts in Mexico and circles around into the United States of all the people who got transplanted in the chain that the Mexican patient-donor pair participated in. So I think it's a very good thing. Now, let me summarize. About markets in general, there are lots of different kinds of markets and marketplaces. I've been telling you about a pretty exotic one, but it's in the same family as all the matching markets, all the ones where we don't let prices do all the work. So it's not a commodity market, a kidney exchange, it's a matching market. And marketplaces, what marketplaces have to do with kidney exchange, what Airbnb has to do when they're setting up a hotel kind of company, is we have to help markets become thick. That's what we're trying to do by bringing more patients into kidney exchange. And then they have to deal with congestion. That's what Airbnb does with the way they organize their app. It's what we do with the way we organize chains. And to be safe and reliable and not repugnant. And as technology changes, new designs are possible. Right, a lot of, just in the time I've been talking to kidney surgeons, there are advances in immunology have made more kinds of kidney transplants possible. And markets need rules, right? I mean, we organize kidney exchange according to pretty clear rules. Airbnb organizes its hotel market according to pretty clear rules. So the political debate that we should be having about markets is not should we have rules or should markets have no rules, but what rules do markets need to work well? And in my book, I wrote about that. I had a paragraph that says, what is a free market? And I said, when we speak about a free market, we shouldn't be thinking of a free-for-all, but rather a market with well-designed rules that make it work well. A market that can operate freely is like a wheel that can turn freely. It needs an axle and well-oiled bearings. How to provide that axle and keep those bearings well-oiled is what market design is about. But let me leave you not with a quote from me, but with a quote from Friedrich Hayek, who's one of the apostles of free markets. And you have to translate a little because he used the word liberal in the way that today we would use the word libertarian. And he says, there's all the difference between deliberately creating a system within which competition will work as beneficially as possible and passively accepting institutions as they are. Probably nothing has done so much harm to the liberal cause as the wooden insistence of some liberals on certain rules of thumb, above all the principles of laissez-faire. So you can see that liberal meant a different thing in 1944 than it does today. It meant a different thing to him than it does to us. And he goes on, he says, the attitude of the liberal towards society is like that of the gardener who tends a plant, and in order to create the conditions most favorable to its growth, must know as much as possible about its structure and the way it functions. And I think that's as good a model for market design as anything. That is, if we want markets to work, markets are human artifacts. We make them in order to allow us to interact with each other better. When they're not working as well as they should, we should fix them. And we fix them by changing their rules. That can happen through government regulation, it can happen through private action by market proprietors and participants, but markets need rules that allow them to work well. As technology changes, we'll need new rules, and we'll need to retire old rules that may no longer be helpful. And that should be, I think, how we think about how we interact with markets. They're tools that we make to work well, to help us interact with each other. Okay, thank you.
Questions?
Sorry.
Thank you once again. So my first question has to do with the idea that these markets that we're working with are markets where price is not a determinant of who gets what. So when we talk about market design and the policy that we can use to help design markets so that they work well, we're usually talking about markets in which prices are a very important factor. So can you elaborate a little bit more on where market design interacts with markets that do operate?
Sure. So, as was mentioned in the introduction, just in the last weeks, the FCC's incentive auction, the biggest spectrum auction, just ended. And the spectrum auction had to do with the fact that lots of broadcasters had excess spectrum that they had been given back in the days when spectrum was were given away. In particular, television broadcasters had spectrum for analog broadcast and then for digital broadcast. And the question was how to bring this back into circulation. And so the incentive auction was a two-sided auction that first assessed how much you'd have to pay to get different amounts of spectrum from the people who held it, and then assessed at different prices how much would be bought by people like T-Mobile and Dish and people who bought a lot of spectrum just recently. So it was a huge auction. It had lots of prices were critically important. That's what the auction is supposed to determine. But so were all sorts of complex broadcasting constraints. So when you're going to reallocate spectrum, you have to make sure that different radio and TV stations aren't interfering with each other as they broadcast. So it turns out the property right, as defined by the FCC, which is part of the market design, was that these stations had a certain amount of spectrum, not a certain band of spectrum. So they reserved the right to say, you don't want to sell your spectrum, you get to keep it. You sell yours, you sell yours. We now consolidate those, and your broadcast will now be on a different frequency with the same bandwidth. And that allowed, that was part of the rules of the market that allowed the federal government to efficiently repackage the spectrum that was freed up. So that's work that the NSF also funded in its early stages. The principal designer was Paul Milgram, a colleague of mine at Stanford. And when he was working in auction theory in the early days, it wasn't at all clear that there would be giant new markets for auctions that there are today. Not just the hugely big number of high-price auctions for spectrum, but also the very, very frequent auctions that Google runs every time you do a search, and they auction your eyeballs to advertisers. So basic research on auctions has led to a lot of big changes in the way we conduct auctions, even though they are ancient forms of price discovery, right? The Romans conducted auctions, the Babylonians, Josephus writes about the Babylonians conducting auctions. So auctions are at the same time, one of the oldest market forms and one of the newest, and they have to be designed, they have rules. Some auctions, the incentive auction, had to constantly, in order to determine who was the winner of spectrum at any moment in the auction, they had to solve all these constraints to make sure that the spectrum that they were buying and selling could be allocated in a way where broadcasters wouldn't interfere with each other. So prices matter a lot in auctions, but it turned out in that auction it wasn't the only thing that mattered. Yeah.
Thinking about the medical resident match, is there a concern that while it may be a very efficient way of allocating residents out, and I can imagine that working really well for the employers, but since there's no kind of competition for prices, you said that's been removed from the process, that like in a more macro sense, it's depressing wages of those participants over time because they have very little chance to negotiate their own salaries?
So I think that is not in fact the case, but your question was, are there concerns about that? And indeed there have been. There was a class action suit, a double class action suit brought by 16 class action law firms on behalf of two residents some years ago. And they wanted to sue on behalf of all the doctors who had been through residencies, all the doctors. And they wanted to sue all the hospitals as a class. So it was a double, they wanted to certify two classes. And that was quite a clever litigation strategy because, of course, the defense costs for the hospitals immediately became very high because they each had to hire their own lawyers and lawyers had to coordinate with each other. But it wasn't a good political strategy because every senator has hospitals. And so Congress, under George W. Bush, in a you guys will know more about this than I've been, on a conference on a pension bill. So the House and Senate had versions that had to be reconciled, and one of the things they reconciled into it was a clause that said that the medical match is certainly subject to antitrust, but it's not a per se violation of the antitrust laws. You would have to demonstrate this harm. You have to demonstrate that it suppresses prices and therefore harms doctors. You couldn't merely say that it was a conspiracy that was a per se violation. And that made the case go away because the evidence is actually quite clear that there are plenty of parts of the medical market that both have and don't have matches, particularly in the fellowships. It's quite clear that it's not the match that determines prices. A lot of what determines prices is Medicare reimbursements, right? So particularly for first-year residents are not licensed to practice medicine in any state of the United States. So they are not billed to third-party providers. They're Medicare paid, things like that. So the federal government has a big role to play in what prices are, and that turns out to be a giant thing, together with a certain cartelization in the medical profession, right? So when you talk about the particular medical specialties, residency programs and fellowship programs have to be accredited for a certain number of positions. So just incidentally, in the United States, in order to, we've been increasing the number of medical students in the United States. We haven't yet been increasing the number of residencies. And so what we're doing is we're substituting American-trained physicians for foreign-trained physicians. We're a big importer of physicians, but we haven't yet done something that will increase the number of physicians who enter practice each year. Yeah?
Thank you very much for your talk. This is great. I was wondering, what are, if there are any, the remaining legal or policy barriers to more effective functioning of the kidney exchange?
Good question. Well, there are a bunch. So one of the things we would like to do better is better integrate the system of deceased donation and living donation. Those are run under very different political and bureaucratic systems, right? So National Organ Transplant Act creates the organ procurement, OPTN, and transplant networks, which have created a contractor called UNOS, United Network for Organ Sharing, which regulates a lot of deceased donation. One thing that would be good to do would be to be able to start some non-directed donor chains with a deceased donor kidney, right? Deceased donors are almost universally non-directed. They're not legally required to be, but the way people die makes them mostly non-directed. But those are very difficult bureaucracies to interpenetrate with each other, right? There are lots of regulations. That's one thing. Another thing is it's legal under the NOTA to pay the costs of a donor, even though you can't compensate a donor, you can't give valuable consideration. But in fact, we don't do a very good job of paying those costs. If you loved me and wanted to give me a kidney, you would probably have several $1,000s of costs. I live in California, you have to fly to California, you have to rent a hotel room near the transplant center where I was a patient for a few days before your surgery, for a few days after your surgery. So you would have real costs. There's an organization which I'm on the advisory board of, it's federally funded, it's called NALDAC, the National Living Donor Assistance Center, or something very close to that. It has a $3.5 million budget. This is in a $50 billion a year industry. And it can only spend $2.5 million. It has $1 million of its budget left over because it's supposed to aid poor donors, but the conditions in which it can do so are so stringent that it can't even give away its $3.5 million each year. So one thing that would be nice would be to at least make it a financially neutral act to give someone a kidney. It saves Medicare $250,000 in the first 5 years, but mostly people have to bear those costs on their own. So it would be good to change that. Those are two things off the top of my head. There are lots of smaller, sillier ones. Medicare pays for transplantation, and then it only pays for 3 years of immunosuppressive drugs. So it comes from a different pocket, apparently, different legislation, different enabling legislation. So there are some people, not so many, because most people can get up and go back to work, but there are some people who Medicare pays for their transplant cheerfully, then it pays for the first 3 years of immunosuppressive drugs, then it stops and they lose the kidney and go back on dialysis, which Medicare cheerfully pays for again, which is much more expensive. So that would be good to fix.